September 2024. And obviously it's been a quiet week with hardly anything to talk about of interest whatsoever. Or for people in the real world who are actually on the planet, you'll have noticed the first draft of the Renters' Rights Bill, as it's now known, having been published with an idea and a stated goal of getting it through the entire process, aka receiving royal assent before the summer recess of 2025. So a realistic timeline for legislation, unlike Angela Rayner's unrealistic timeline before the election of day one, section 21 will be banned or whatever. My concern about all of that was always the fact that Rayner didn't even understand what the process was for passing a law, but that can't obviously have been true because she'd already been an MP for some years. But there we go. So I like to start each week with a quote, and this week I've gone with one of the great philosophers of all time, Bob Marley, and get up, stand up. Don't worry, I won't sing it. Stand up for your rights. Get up, stand up, don't give up the fight. And it's a little bit of a reminder that there are rights on both sides, realistically, of the equation. And whilst there's quite a lot of lies, really, that have gone on in terms of saying that things will get better for landlords here and landlords' possession processes will be beefed up, they haven't gone with the processes that have already been put in places like Scotland, where there has been a genuine attempt, actually, to improve the situation for landlords. As well, and try and make, apart from anything else, recovery of possession procedures and things like that a little bit better. But look, before I get started in anger, I am contractually obligated to mention to you our property business workshop on Tuesday the 1st of October. It's going to be a great one. It's almost like Rod and I saw the future on this one, because we're going to be talking about exit. But remember, we're not just talking about your own exit. I think this is a great time to be getting involved in the PRS, and I know millions of people would disagree with me on that front. But what are you going to know? What do you want to know about exits? Well, you want to know about how helping other people to exit, because believe me, there's going to be plenty of them. And like always, these situations are always the same. There's going to be much more fear before the Renters' Rights Bill becomes law. There's going to be so much speculation, everything's going to fall apart and all the rest of it. And do you know what, by the time we get there, it absolutely won't. But people will sell on the back of that fear. They will sell on the basis of it's all changed and this, that and the other's going on. And if you can help them to structure their exit correctly, I'm sure you can benefit from that in the short, medium and long term, realistically. And ultimately, so can they. Because apart from anything else, one of the things I see all the time when it comes to exit is that HMRC are going to take an unnecessarily large slice of the pie. Not through crafty schemes that you've got to pay dodgy non-tax advisors loads and loads of money for. Ultimately, it's not about that at all. It's about just making sure you only pay what you're due to pay, apart from anything else, because of the way you structure the sale, depending on what you're selling, depending on what wrapper you're selling it with, and all the rest of it. But anyway, that's enough about that. If you haven't already signed up, haven't already bought a ticket, the tickets are at bit.ly/PBWFOUR. There's still early bird prices for 2 more days only. So get on that link as quickly as you can if you haven't already booked. If you've been thinking about booking, get on with it, because the prices will go up by more than 10% this week coming. So please get on with it. Right, enough. As I said earlier, a bit of a quiet week, really, not much to talk about. So you didn't fall for that one and you're still here, so let's get on with it. There are claims here about seismic cataclysms that are going to wreck the UK rental market in real time, usually to get people to click on YouTube videos. Let's face it, you know this channel's not like that, and I prefer to have a robust debate around the truth, because I find the truth most useful in business and in life, apart from anything else. So anyone who's listened to or read more than a dozen of the many hundreds now of supplements that I've written and recorded will know that's not really my style. And there's a reason why I say keep calm and carry on every week, because I think that's the number one mindset that you need in property. But there is no denying that this redrafted Renters' Rights Bill will dominate discussions over the next 6 to 9 months before it goes through Parliament. And it's worth remembering at this point, we do have a 2-house system of government in the UK. I almost said the words 2-tier there, but it's been said far too many times this summer. An unwritten constitution. So convention dictates that in the Lords, you can be difficult for a while, batting things back, batting things forward. But then, ultimately, you roll over, especially in the face of such a big majority in the Commons. So there'll be a robust debate. Remember, there are a number of peers that have given up their official party affiliations and are now what they call crossbench, apart from anything else. And this is a crossbench situation. We've already had, 3 or 4 backs and forths in the Commons on the original bill, with lots of good things brought up. And those same things are going to be brought up again, but even more of them, because it's even more very unbalanced from the status quo as we stand today in the favour of the tenant. This bill is 98% in favour of the tenant. The only real good news for the landlord, to be honest, is what's not in there that some people feared would be in there. So before you sell your portfolios and move to Rio or Dubai or possibly Whitehaven, depending on the numbers at the moment, I think we just need to start this conversation with that in mind, and that will help us to keep calm. We've also got probably a once in a parliament or once in a decade or even more opportunity to actually be heard here at a political level. Conference season is coming up, and I'm working behind the scenes on some political comms and drafts with the hope of getting some traction with support from one of the UK's top buy-to-let lenders, who I can reveal are already considering not lending to non-portfolio landlords if the bill was passed in its current form. So, as I say, I'm not a sensationalist, but I think that's a pretty big deal. It's a massive deal for the whole sector. And in honesty, from an economic perspective, massive advantage for people already in, right? Massive disadvantage for people who would like to get in, realistically, if that was to happen. I'm not saying it's a probable outcome, but look, it's already on the slate this week from some lenders. So you need to consider how seriously some people are taking it, apart from anything else. That would be what we call in economics a barrier to entry, and it would be one mighty barrier to entry. If I operated solely on my own self-interest, then pulling up the old drawbridge would be a phenomenal result for me and my portfolio, and a phenomenal result for those with existing portfolios. But you know what? I don't. I wouldn't put the time and effort each week into painstakingly researching, writing, and recording this piece if I was that guy, right? I believe that would genuinely create a horrific imbalance for the tenant, a dystopian, dysfunctional market stuffed with extra economic profit for the likes of me. And I'm still willing to try my best to stop what would be one of some gigantic mistakes occurring that would lead to that situation. And you wouldn't find that from a public limited company director, I'll tell you that for free. So, before all of this, we do have to stick to the knitting. We can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. There's reason why there's structure to the supplement aside from anything else, because it hasn't exactly been a quiet week on the macro front either. So I'm going to press on, first of all, with the real-time market analysis. Always give a cheers to Chris Watkin. Chris, thank you for being you. Delivers week in, week out on these with some of his bonus content sometimes as well. Listings are still ploughing on, 38,600 across the UK, very much back to 2024 business as usual. This was reporting on the week after the bank holiday, remember, so this is like back to school week that we're reporting on here. Big numbers of listings, still maintaining that rough 7.5% difference from the number of listings in the average year between 2017 and 2019, which is the baseline, if you like, before the pandemic completely distorted the market. Net sales also outperformed, 29% better on net sales than the equivalent week last year, and just over 15% higher than the pre-pandemic market for the same week. So, yeah, lots of stuff going on, but also lots of stuff selling. And actually, if you look at it on the pre-pandemic basis, 7.5% more listings, but 15% more sales. So actually, the market's starting to rebalance a little bit in favour of the vendor, and it's not as much of a buyer's market as it's been. I think you probably know that if you followed it in any sort of real-time way over the past several months. So Chris is still leading on the sales prices with a 1.22% drop in price from April. So don't get carried around August pricing. Chris does not seasonally adjust his figures. So bear that in mind. You always expect, we saw a lot of cheaper stock coming to market in August because the agents simply operate on the basis that it's August. It's got to be cheaper in order to attract attention. There's not as many people around. Market's getting busier again now. And you see later on in the figures a massive increase in the listing price, although that's a London distortion effect of back to school week that happens in the figures every year. So this is the danger of doing week to weeks. You sometimes get distortionary effects, but if you know what they are, it's always good to talk about them and understand them. So I'm not changing my 5% capital growth for 2024, the 2024 market. I haven't seen a need to change it at any point this year. I'm still pretty convinced it's going to be pretty close to the nail when we get to, well, it'll be February 25 by the time we know the real ONS figures. I pay scant attention to Halifax and Nationwide, to be honest. While I do comment on them, I do think they do some good analysis, and they're more real time, obviously, but it's more about inspiring confidence in the market than them having any statistical robustness and validity to them, as we've seen from their terrible predictions over the past few years, including a dropping market for this year, according to the pair of them, which was just a nonsense prediction. Nonsense prediction in December 23, and even more of a nonsense prediction now. But there we go. So, listing prices dramatically back up, as I said, at the central London effect. Price reductions really moved. We were at 1 in 10 properties per month getting reduced last week. We're at 1 in 6.6 properties getting reduced now, so much more commonplace. That's over 100,000 properties a month that are being reduced. So understand how much stock there is out there to shoot at, folks, if you're still someone who buys off the open market. Houses are selling, they have to be fairly priced, and there has to be something to make them stand out. So if we move to the macro, this week was a biggie, right? The labour market report and unemployment growth or lack thereof. The RICS house price balance, which I like to report on, was very balanced. The comfort blanket of a gorgeous looking week in the gilts markets for the borrowers out there. All sounds very innocuous before I get onto the renters' rights bill, doesn't it? I'm going to keep it as punchy as possible because we need to leave room for this RRB. I just noticed that RRB is BRR backwards, which is a very interesting, funny how these coincidences occur in real life, isn't it? But unemployment figures, well, it was a week of mixed fortunes for the interest rate. As far as the figures were, generally speaking, good news for all participants who want a sensible and balanced labour market. Most of the economic consensus was very close. We saw what had largely been in the PMI job surveys and the wider PMI reports as a whole for July play out in real time. Headline rate of unemployment down to 4.1. That was what was expected. Average earnings, arguably more relevant at the moment because this is the Bank of England keeps citing this figure, dipped to 4% year on year. But again, when you look behind and you peel back the onion, I've made the argument for years now that I vastly prefer the figure without bonuses because COVID inspired so many one-off bonuses trying to keep people happy without racking up a year-on-year increased cost apart from anything else. So if you include the bonus, average is 4.4%, but that's because there were lots of NHS and civil service payments made in June and July 2023, which will now drop out of the figures next month when we report on them. So the without bonus is still up 5.1%, so still above that psychological 5% barrier. That's much more likely to be the real cost that's impacting companies in the economy. And north of 5% is still big. But the good news, if you like, is it's that 4% that it applies, depends if you're a pensioner or not, or approaching pension age, but that's what applies for the triple lock. But I'll talk a little bit about that later. So the employment rate moved back to 74.8%, which is much better. We've been down lower this year, although 76 is sort of where we really belong, I would argue, in this economy, but it's still nearer to where it needs to be. The direction of travel is good. Unemployment decreased. Inactivity also decreased back to below 22%, although we've still got a significant hundreds of thousands strong inactivity problem, which is based on a whole number of things, non-means tested benefits being one of them, quite frankly. So vacancies continue to drop as well. So it's 26 periods now in a row. That's effectively 26 months, but they report quarterly, if you like. So it's like rolling quarterly reporting. 26 months in a row where vacancies have dropped, but we're still at over 850,000 job vacancies, which is still above where we were in 2019. So still very much a buyer's market in terms of the employee, but nowhere near where it was. It's really calmed down, and it does appear to be more functional. This is where we want it to be. So regular pay grew by 2.2% if you apply CPI. So that's inflation adjusted from that 5.1% figure, which is a pretty sweet spot to be. The headline would be about 1.4 because that 4% is much lower than the 5.1. But as I say, the 5.1 is the real number, in my opinion. It's just a problem with how you measure statistics sometimes. And we've added 265,000 jobs in the last 3 months in the UK. That's the best quarter since November 2022 when, okay, I'm not going to start on it this week, I promise. But as predicted over recent months, the job market actually looks healthy. This weakens the case to cut interest rates if the economy is doing fine, although it doesn't look like an overheating jobs market at this time. But the if it ain't broke, don't fix it brigade, who tend to be on the more hawkish side, so they want to keep interest rates higher, do tend to frame the arguments in this sort of way. So growth, the 2 months that straddle the election have now had their results released, and they printed a big fat 0. Right, the expectation was about 0.2% for July, but the quarterly rolling 0.5% figure, which you'd have to think now all came from May pretty much because June and July did 0, still keeps everybody happy. The June 0% print wasn't a surprise. This was a bit more surprising. So leading up to the election, more uncertainty, not as much economic activity. The actual election itself, well, there's a couple of things there realistically. Number one, Thursday, on election day, does GDP drop anyway? I don't know the historical studies on that or whether there are too many of them, but it could cost you sort of 0.1% quite easily. Also, England got to the final in the Euros. That was a Sunday night. The Monday might not have been the most productive work day in the world. Of course, pubs and hospitality took more money, but the realistic economic impact of something like that is negative for the country. So bear those two things in mind. Also bear in mind the standard UK excuse gets wheeled out in these situations. The weather wasn't very good in July. We've had a very wet year, and that has probably impacted GDP in a number of ways. But it is a variable. It doesn't help GDP in the summer months if you've got not that great weather. So services grew by 0.1 for July, and they lost 0.1 in June. So that basically defines the economy. It's 80% of the GDP. We talk about construction because we're interested in construction, but it's 6% of GDP. So that's where it sits these days. Production output, construction output, both contracted for July. I wouldn't have expected that in construction because apart from else, the PMIs were so very positive. But just remember month to month, if something drops into June the 30th or it drops into August the 1st, instead of being in July, it could make a huge difference if it's a big contract. So it just depends. I don't read too much into month to month figures. I'm still pretty confident August will print either 0.2 or 0.3 in terms of economic growth based on what we saw in the PMIs. If I had to choose a number right now, I'd choose 0.2 for August growth. We'll find that out in a month's time, by the way. So the white box commentary in the ONS. So the ONS, the Office for National Statistics, do a survey in which this is how they find out all this information from bigger businesses. Businesses are usually required to respond by law. It's not an optional thing. But I'm not sure that you get thrown in jail if you don't report on it. And COVID, like it did with everything, messed with their systems apart from anything else on this front. But businesses can anecdotally report what played a part. Why did business think July played out as it did? It might offer some insight. It's not always quantifiable, but it's interesting. I talked about the Euros. That was a boost in arts, entertainment, recreation and retail. But some restaurants reported a negative because, of course, instead of going out for dinner, people decided to go to the pub or stay in and get a takeaway, apart from anything else. Lots more visited Paris, right, due to the Summer Olympics. That would help travel, but it wouldn't help GDP at home because people who otherwise might have been in the UK over the summer were in France. So you have to consider things like that as well. Time off for the Euros could have affected GDP. As I said, that unofficial bank holiday Monday after the disappointing final result probably would have cost more economically if England had won, interestingly enough. But it still will have had an impact because a number of businesses sort of gave it as a morning off or did this, that or the other. So the category I watch the most in the growth figures, which is, it won't surprise you, buying and selling, renting and operating of own or leased real estate, excluding imputed rental, that grew at a very small number for the month but remained contracting over the quarter. And this is manifested in the fact that, apart from anything else, I think the fourth biggest category of high street shops that have shut in the first half of 2024 is estate agents, because they had a tough time in 2023 and the market maybe is getting a bit better, but they're still absolutely fighting over landlord instructions. Whilst landlords using agents, that number is contracting. One, because of cost of living mortgage side of things, apart from anything else. And number two, the rise of something like open rent, which is now listing one of every 8 properties in the UK, which a lot of landlords are operating themselves, not using an agent to do. And of course, that, to me, that's been a bit of a no-brainer for a long time in terms of showing the property to the widest marketplace, because Open Rent put it on 225 odd portals. But this podcast is not sponsored by Open Rent, just to be clear. Other solutions are also available, but it is pretty good. So back to the rates point. No growth would suggest that base rate might be high enough to be stifling economic activity. So a zero print could say we need to cut rates in order to get the economy going. Now, the MPC at the Bank of England are likely to just write it off as this is what happened around the election. That's probably what I'd be doing. I was a little bit surprised by July's number because the PMIs were a bit better than that, but the PMIs might have indicated intention post-election rather than actual activity. So let's see. But I'm confident August figures will be okay. And if they're okay, they're going to set the trend for the MPC meeting in November. Now, we've got the Bank of England committee meeting this week. I really don't expect the bank to cut rates this week. That would be a real surprise to me if they did. I never thought they would in this meeting, to be honest with you. And the economic consensus has now moved to be completely with me. The 65 economists that they survey, 0 of them think they'll cut the rate next meeting. There are still a few who think they'll cut in November and December. I'm absolutely convinced those people are wrong as well. 2 cuts I see as exceedingly unlikely unless something happens that we haven't priced in at the moment. 1 cut in November, look, it's the favourite outcome. 0 of those 65 also think we won't cut for the rest of the year. And whilst that's not my active prediction, you have to distinguish here between what people think is impossible. So 0 in 65 think that could happen. I think it could happen. I think it's got as much of a 20% probability that we have no cut in November. So it's 80-20. And this is what's difficult to understand about expected value and markets, and why most people should never ever attempt to place a bet on a market one way or another in their lifetimes, because what you need to do is look for situations of extreme value. And if an economist is willing to offer me 64-1 or 65-1, because I'm the only one in 66 of them who thinks we might not have a cut in November, then I'd happily take that bet, and I'd be wise to do so if my 20% probability is anywhere near correct. But there we go. So NISA, the National Institute for Economic and Social Research, produced pretty decent monthly GDP trackers in pretty much real time. They're forecasting 0.2% growth for Q3. So I feel pretty good about that, because I didn't look at that before I did my prediction. I looked at it afterwards because I don't like to be influenced by these things. I am concerned by the Starmer and Reeves negativity weighing on business output. And I mentioned this last week. It did creep into the PMIs. I'll reserve judgment when the September PMIs are out. But look, I've definitely adjusted my own forecast downwards. And I don't think this looks like a bad number at all, as we now look like we probably won't hit the 2% growth for the year that I thought might work. And I thought it might work for some time, but let's see. So enough on the growth or the lack thereof. The brief pocket heat wave or something must have cheered the surveyors up in recent weeks. So as so often, it's the headline number that by definition makes the headlines. And in spite of a consensus of -14, we actually printed a positive number, a massive 1, a whole 1. The best number since September 22 when, not again. 1 is a good number for the business overall in the sector, I'd say. It's on the back of improved sales market activity. That's what the real-time stats told us throughout August. And it also cites recent modest softening in mortgage rates too. The expectation is more impetus. +15 is noted. An increase in new buyer inquiries in August. Newly agreed sales ticked up to +6 from -1 last month. Near term, that's 3-month sales expectations, hit +37%, and +45% see strengthening sales activity over the next 12 months. So there's no expectation in a slowdown in stock hitting the market, and that should also be noted for anybody selling anything. But as they split the data down, RICS note that Wales, the South East and the South West remain weaker, and they cite Northern Ireland and Scotland as leading the charge. The expectation of a price increase is now at over 50% upwards over the next 12 months. So remember how this survey actually works. That would mean 75% of respondents think prices are going upwards, with only 25% thinking they might go down or remain the same. This is the best reading since April 2022, and it's the most bullish sign in this survey. The writing is on the wall for an increasing market over the next 12 months. The net landlord instruction balance was again negative and slipped back from -9 to -21. And the net letting balance of +11, which is not seasonally adjusted, simply represents one more month when tenant demand is net upwards and supply of new units to the agents is net downwards. And remember, this is just the agents. Like I said, lots of landlords have been having to, or felt they've had to cut agents out of the process, rightly or wrongly. I think usually wrongly, because it means they're not valuing their own time. But, you know, if the numbers don't work, the numbers don't work, do they? So thoughts on rental increases are +39%, but the last 2 surveys has been +38%. So no massive difference, but statistically, historically, still pretty high. And that's enough for the RICS balance, really. The gilts. It was a pleasing week. We opened at 3.701 on the 5-year, and we closed at 3.508, down almost 20 basis points for the week. I'd love to see it below 3.5, of course we would, but it's pretty lush. There was a tiny uptick on the basis of the employment data because we saw that strong job creation, but then there was a much bigger drop on the revelations of zero growth compared to the consensus of 0.2, and nothing else really moved the needle after a Monday that trended downwards all day, which started our week off. Thursday we closed at 3.53 on the 5-year yield, and the 5-year SONIA swap last traded at 3.417, which preserved that beautiful 10 basis point discount and moved into that glorious territory under 3.5%, which opens up more possibility for more cuts to the interest rate. So remember what I say, this could put 5-year buy-to-let funding down to about 5.4 at the moment. So I'll repeat what I repeat always in these situations when you have a big drop. If you haven't got to offer yet on any refinancing, right, make sure your broker's checking before you get to offer. Have the rates come down. These product rates will come down. I don't think in the next 7 days they'll particularly be coming down, because we've got a Bank of England meeting and the Federal Reserve have got a meeting, and those things will have an impact. If the Fed only cut 0.25%, which is strongly where I think they'll be, and the Bank of England don't cut, as I and pretty much everybody else now, finally now they've got the message, thinks that will be as well, that probably won't move the needle that much. It might raise the gilt yield a little bit, because in America it's still a bit of a coin toss, according to the experts, between a 0.25% cut and a 0.5% cut. I'm leaning on a 0.25% cut because I don't think they're not committing when they've made a mistake. And I think they probably have made a mistake waiting till now to cut, but 0.5% basically puts your hand up and says, yeah, we got it wrong. 0.25% says, nope, this is how we're doing it, folks, and you don't like it, but tough luck. And politically, for their own reputational management, I worry that plays too much of a part in the rate setting committee for the Federal Reserve. But of course, that's just my thoughts on it. That's because human beings are involved ultimately. The harder part is working the vote out for the Bank of England. You'll know that I like to try and do that. I'm going to punt that we'll be at 7-2 in favour of the hold, because I think Dave Ramsey will still find a reason to cut. And I know that Swati Dhingra will, you can absolutely take to the bank that she will find a reason to cut. She's very much on the cutting side of the fence, but I think the others may well move back into line. Could see as little as a 5-4 in favour of holding, but I don't see that happening. I don't think the governor's for moving this time round. We'll see, and will the deputy governor be influenced by that or trying to influence him? I don't know. This is the game of chess that gets played at the MPC. I don't think it will move the needle much, but we do have the inflation rate on Tuesday, which will change things depending on consensus versus reality. But anyway, that's the macro. It's time to get into the real meat for this week. I think the macro this week did show us why it's worthwhile looking at the PMIs and trying to stay in touch with the real-time figures, because a lot of this played out in very, very similar to the real-time figures, or didn't surprise us too much to the downside. So, into the deep dive, into the renters' rights bill, the one you've all been waiting for, or not waiting for, depending on your viewpoint. A little bit of a caveat first of all, right? No bill is law until it's received royal assent. There is a system, there is a process. Lots to do before this one is written up. There will be lobbying, a limited amount, and almost all by institutional landlords, but there will be lobbying. There will be pushback because housing is always such an emotive topic. There is time here for some of these potential mistakes not to be made. Decisions in this game are not made in the moment or on a dime. They are made in time. And over many of the last years, threats to sell up, or broadcasts of intention, if you prefer to call them that, haven't really played out, in honesty. What has occurred is exactly what Mark Carney's Bank of England said would happen. Interest rate sensitivity is much larger in the PRS than it is for people's personal homes, and therefore landlords have sold up as interest rates move significantly against them. However, the risk in the bank size, since the functioning or not of the rental market is not really of their concern, the only thing they care about would property prices plummet, because that might have a knock-on effect to the economy. That's not happened, as I've said, despite most of the other forecasters out there, 90+% of them, forecasting incredibly bearishly over a lot of the last 4 years. It just hasn't played out apart from anything else. And as I've banged on about, in fact, when you get into the data, when you look at it all, when you adjust for wages, when you adjust for inflation, property's cheap today. It's cheap, and it's cheaper than it has been for some years. But why bother with the truth? Because it doesn't make headlines, does it? So we don't really care about it, or some of us do anyway. So inflation masked everything, it absorbed it all, and instead what's happened is things have adjusted significantly in real terms after we've applied inflation, but hardly at all in nominal terms for the last 2 years. So, with that all in mind, into the breach. There's a million ways we could approach this. The bill itself is incredibly wordy, and line by lining the actual bill, before all the batting around has been done, amendments, committees, blah, 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 the likes, it's not going to provide a return on my time, it's not going to provide a return on your time, and so at this stage, I'm not going to do it. But on gov.uk, you do get about as promotional a piece as you ever get from the government, to be honest. When you have a big bill, you get some guidance around bills when they're proposed. And there is some guidance on the government website, which is where I'm concentrating my efforts for this week. It's a critique from me. It's a few words about unintended consequences that will follow. So this article on the site leads with the dramatic victory that is the ending of Section 21 evictions. And that's no surprise. This was the political point that was made. I don't really think they've got any idea about what will really be changed by the removal of Section 21 and the actual impact on things. I don't think it changes that much at all, to be honest with you, to give you a bit of a spoiler alert. Because apart from anything else, we're mostly talking about situations that do not occur in 90+% of tenancies. So let's frame it in the correct way. And I do appreciate some people have businesses that I know listen to and read the supplement where they issue way more Section 21s than we do. To be clear, we deal in the nicest possible way, usually secondary areas in terms of their economic activity, but we focus on working tenants who are likely not to be in the bottom 20 to 30% of the household earning demographic, because we're not focusing on the cheapest stuff in an area. We're focusing on cheap areas, but we're not necessarily focusing on comparatively cheap stock. As a general rule, as a general strategic rule, we have picked up differing stuff over the years, as you can imagine, when you've got hundreds of units. So the dramatic victory in the promotional piece of the ending of Section 21, and this is my immediate fear. There's a massive misunderstanding and misconception of why Section 21 is served in the first place. Firstly, it's so often used, and yes, in the spirit of the law, abused to regain possession when there absolutely is fault, even though it's supposed to be a no-fault notice, but there is fault in the eyes of the landlord. Secondly, the next best reason to regain possession, apart from rent arrears, is to sell a property, right? Compromise of private property rights, I believe 80% or more of the electorate as a rule would find unacceptable. And so this will have to appear in the new legislation anyway. Not that there is too much compromise on private property rights. There's a bit, but not really much that already exists in a fixed term tenancy situation anyway, to be honest. So I'm always wary of sort of dismissing these things as, oh, don't worry, it's not a big deal, because there's always the thin end of the wedge argument as well. And you will hear that from me today. I don't struggle to appreciate it. I definitely see it, but I think we need a broader discussion. So today I'm also going to refer to Scotland quite a bit. Only tenancies that started before the 1st of December 2017 in Scotland are still subject to what the Scots called an SAT rather than an AST. That was a short assured tenancy. And then since then, a prescribed form has always been used for tenants, so a government website template called a PRT, right? That has no fixed term. That's exactly what's going to go on in England. So if you think the UK proposals are bad, in Scotland, a tenant can give 28 days notice at any time, including on the day of move-in, with the landlords needing to give 3 months notice. So they have to give treble the amount of notice that the tenant does, and they have to jump through a number of hoops depending on the reason for the notice. And it's worth noting here, this has not crushed the system in Scotland. Indeed, from experience of owning and asset managing over 100 units in Scotland, although we had considerably fewer before the 1st of December 2017, it's changed very little at all. The vast majority of the fears were unfounded. What has ruined the sector in Scotland in recent years is rent increases, which have been linked to interest rate increases, of course, and massive cost increases for landlords, and the draconian response to those rent increases in the form of rent cap legislation. And Scotland have recently announced they will be persisting with rent cap legislation. This basically mandates how much rents can be put up each year. This is one of those perverse situations where, given that they've already made this massive mistake, they actually might as well carry on with this horrific policy. In order to woo investors back to the sector, they need a much more dramatic reversal than just scrapping rent caps. They need to actually actively incentivise people into the sector, which is just not happening under that current administration. It's so far ideologically away from where they are. Even if it would help the tenant, they ain't going to do it because they don't understand how the market works, right? So where's the evidence for all of this? Well, in recent lending data, Scotland was the least invested by percentage of anywhere in the UK for buy-to-let. Only £1 in every £20 lent at the moment in Scotland is for a buy-to-let purpose on secured loans. This is worse than £1 in every £13 in London, which is the next lowest throughout the UK. In 2016, which was the PRS peak year in England as well, in terms of its size, Scotland had 370,000 households in the PRS. Now they're at about 340,000, but the data is slow, so slow and so out of date. It's not managed by the ONS in Scotland. The horse will be so far gone past the gate by the time anything's done about it, and by the time they've got some workable data, all they'll be doing is navel gazing when they get it. So even so, look, if 1 in 7 households is a rental, but only 5% of mortgages contribute to buy to let, because that's the size of the PRS in Scotland, right? 14%. You can do the maths yourself. Ultimately, you cannot possibly be growing at any form of a sustainable rate if the population is growing, which of course it is. So Scotland gives us a good steer, I think, on how worried we really should be or shouldn't be about this whole situation. It also gives lawmakers a really good precedent about how they made these changes without upsetting the apple cart particularly. If they don't learn from this, and politically the main reason why they wouldn't is because politics is pathetic and they can't look at what the SNP have done or anybody has done and say it's any good. They can only look at what the Labour Party in Wales have done and say that's any good, even when it's rubbish, which I'll move on to in a second. But look, let's bear in mind from the start, both of those sectors, PRS in England, PRS in Scotland, are actively shrinking or have shrunk in the past 8 years. That's the government data, right? So that's where we're starting from before we consider anything else. So over to Wales, because both Scotland and Wales have a mandatory licensing system, like the one that's been proposed in the RRB. Wales made the old contracts change back in 2022. They've preferred the term occupation contract. So they did change things for everybody. They first of all said new tenancies will have to be, and then they set another date and said, right now, old tenancies will have to become occupation contracts, right? So that's exactly how it was in England before the Housing Act 1988 was passed to an extent, the older regulated tenancies. So Scotland have kept the ability to have the older SAT tenancies if you signed it before the 1st of December 2017, to be clear, which is what we've done in England to protect regulated tenancies pre-Housing Act 1988. Welsh rents have been rising, right? The ONS has got the regional data, and I don't talk about this very often because we're going down to a pretty deep dive level, but let me pull a few examples of some less well-off areas. This is new plus existing tenancies. So remember, this is the ONS data. They've got about 550,000 rentals around the UK that they monitor in terms of their rent levels. So about 23% of them turn over every year. So they go usually reset to market rent, as you can imagine. And then the other 77% are existing tenancies. So this is the best data by a million miles that anyone's got in the UK. So a few of these you might know. If you don't know much about Wales, you won't, but you'll just have to take it from me. They're not the economic massive engines. The last one is a little bit better off, but it's not Cardiff at the end of the day. So Merthyr Tydfil, 14.3% rent increase since January 2023. Torfaen, 19.6% rent increase since January 2023. Blaenau Gwent, 13.5%. Rhondda Cynon Taf, RCT, to those who know, 15.8% up. Neath Port Talbot, MPT, up 13.9. Swansea, up 17.1. And that data goes to July, so it's just over 18 months, right? It's 19 months of data, nearly 1% a month, more than 1% a month in Torfaen. So it's not great, is it, realistically? So it might not be as bad as it looks because this might be catching up to inflation, minimum wage rises and the likes, but it doesn't look like a very functional market, does it? So before we start to hold Scotland and Wales, especially Wales, up as examples of things done well, let's acknowledge that the largest single factor of late, by a massive amount, has been the change in interest rates. So let's dwell on that momentarily. The average interest-only mortgage, which average leverage landlord is using, is up over 100% in cost. If we look at BBR, which is the rate I discussed last week, the standard variable rate from the big banks, which is published and recorded by the Bank of England, sitting up at nearly 8% at the moment when it was down in the 3s a few years ago. So a huge increase on those sort of loans, the variable rates. If we just look at fixed pricing instead, and we start with 2019, so forget the ultra low interest rates of the pandemic, never sustainable. The average buy-to-let is up about 80% in cost. And because they're interest-only mortgages, that's just an 80% increase in payments. Doesn't look the same in a repayment situation, which is an important thing to understand. So huge increases that are now coming down, but coming down fairly slowly. So there's not going to be this dramatic sort of drop, right? So Let us recap. Even in the old environment, going back to 2019, the sector wasn't growing and it was tending instead towards shrinking a little bit. There was hostility and the likes from government to landlord. The old days are gone and the change in interest rates has had a far larger impact than anything else. This tenet, which I will keep repeating, is key to remember because on that front, the worst is over. But further hostility, even with cheap money, was still discouraging people to reinvest in the sector and expand in the sector. So what it does in the era of normal or expensive money will surely be significant. Okay, that has set the scene. Let us go back to the government guide. The claims are to build a better sector for landlords and tenants, without really saying what better looks like or any economic discussion around better. It says there will be greater stability and security, which is noble, but if there are fewer properties, at what cost? And is that a price worth paying? It will also avoid the risk of homelessness, apparently. Well, I'm afraid, friends, that is nonsense. So the next claim is that millions of people in England live day in, day out with the knowledge that they and their families could be uprooted from their home with little notice and minimal justification, and a significant minority of them are forced to live in substandard properties for fear that a complaint would lead to an instant retaliatory eviction. I feel no time is to be wasted here on significant minorities because it's simply a failure of enforcement by local authorities of powers that they already have. I also don't believe that millions of people do live with that knowledge day in, day out. I think they get on with their lives like we all do, and I think this shadow in the cupboard is exactly that, an outrageous and overblown claim to justify this level of intervention. A functioning private rented sector can provide a secure stepping stone for aspiring homeowners and flexibility for those who want it. They almost talk about people who rent out of choice in a dismissive way, like everybody wants to own a home, and they will always fail to recognise that there are millions and millions of people who want and need geographic flexibility for reasons from students all the way on upwards to people who work more than about 5 miles away from where they grew up. But that's their way. So the insecurity embedded in the current tenancy system fails both those tenants looking for a stable home for their families and those landlords who are undercut by the rogues and chancers. It is a drain on aspiration, and reform is central to our opportunity mission, so all have the chance to achieve their potential. Now, I know little or nothing of this undercutting, and I'd love to hear from people that do. With 22 applicants for the average property at this time, according to Zoopla, there's just no room for this behaviour in the market. There's nothing secure about rocketing rents that are the result of badly managed inflation, inflated money supply, and comparative disincentives for PRS landlords. Anyway, here's the overview, which benefits from a bit more close scrutiny. The big one: abolishing Section 21 evictions and moving to a simpler tenancy structure where all assured tenancies are periodic, providing more security for tenants and empowering them to challenge poor practice and unfair rent increases without fear of eviction. We will implement this system in one stage, giving all tenants security immediately. I see limited reasoning in suspecting people already cower in fear at the thought of reporting their landlord, but suddenly they'll be empowered by this change. It just isn't congruent. The one-stroke issue has the largest issue for student landlords, increasing risk gigantically in that sector. And again, for this, we can look to Scotland. Student is by no means my specialist area, and for clarity, I own 0 student HMOs. But there are some interesting research papers and articles produced on this in Scotland. I'm not going to surprise anyone when I say what's gone on there is HMO landlords exiting, excess student demand, student homelessness, and insufficient amounts of PBSA in the right areas. So PBSA, if you don't know, it's purpose-built student accommodation. There is a link in this week's supplement to a housing evidence paper that's been put together in Scotland, and it's well worth a read if you're interested. I very much hope they bring that up to the debate in Parliament. One solution is long-term PRS leasing, and the sensible and entrepreneurial universities will, I'm sure, already be looking at getting into this in a larger way than they already are in order to try and make sure their students have got somewhere to live. Because the reality is, in a tightening private rental sector with a growing population, many people who operate student HMOs can operate professional HMOs. Why do they operate them as student? Because it makes them more money, right? Because they don't pay the bills, apart from anything else. Don't introduce the moral hazard of you paying the bills for somebody else who might just leave the heating on and the windows open, aside from anything else, right? But they are still flexible, and so many of them are protected by this walled garden of Article 4 these days, apart from anything else. If the risk to student goes up massively and they decide they're going to go to professional, where do the students go? because there's very rarely a glut of student housing anywhere. Now, if the university sector's shrinking, and it's not clear this year as to what's happened because there's been a huge amount of people go through clearing, but if universities are going to be allowed to go bust, which is a current potential possibility, apart from anything else, the government have said there's not going to be a bailout, but let's see what happens because there's no guarantee. They usually say there isn't going to be a bailout until there's a bailout in these situations. So let's see what happens. But you could end up with growing universities and cities where the universities like Coventry, where Coventry University and Warwick University have both grown dramatically over recent years. If those patterns were to carry on, you're going to end up with big problems in accommodation in Coventry. Arguably, they're already there. And arguably now there's enough student accommodation in Coventry, but we'll see how everything gets grown into. Anyway, next point. Ensuring possession grounds are fair to both parties, giving tenants more security, while ensuring landlords can recover their property when reasonable. The bill introduces new safeguards for tenants, giving them more time to find a home if landlords evict to move in or sell, and ensuring unscrupulous landlords cannot misuse grounds. Fair, apparently, means an extra month without paying rent for a Section 8 to be valid. So moving 3 to 2. So we get to, an extra free month, really, for people who are not paying their rent. An extra 2 weeks before eviction. In that situation, we move from 2 weeks to 4. So on average, an extra 6.33 weeks to tenants who do make the decision to prioritise other things rather than their contractual obligation to pay for the roof over their head. Instead, though, let's just distract everyone by talking about situations that are far less common than rent arrears. There'll be no way that the new grounds will stop unscrupulous landlords. More legislation means more loopholes. I see zero attempt to bring fairness to the landlord side here, so framing it like this is just disingenuous, silly, and treating landlords like idiots. Provide stronger protections against backdoor eviction by ensuring tenants are able to appeal excessive above-market rents, which are purely designed to force them out. As now, landlords will already still be able to increase rents to market price for their properties, and an independent tribunal will make a judgment on this if needed. Well, this will save no one at all. I haven't even seen one single anecdotal shelter or generation rent example of a rent rise linked to a rise that's excessively above market. The problem is where the market rent is in the first place, and people who haven't had their rent put up for years suddenly having their rent put up. That's a massive problem, but we're just ignoring it. It's a waste of breath, to be honest with you. But there we go. Introduce a new private rental sector landlord ombudsman that will provide quick, fair, impartial and binding resolution for tenants' complaints about their landlord. This will bring tenant-landlord complaint resolution on par with established redress practices for tenants in social housing and consumers of property agent services. So for those who are not experienced with ombudsman in general, right, the law of unintended consequences here will be the tenants will be advised to threaten with the ombudsman all the time. Then there'll be a fee to pay to the ombudsman by the landlord, and that fee will be between 250 and 750 quid per case that goes to the ombudsman. You'll have to pay for access to the ombudsman in the first place, and then you'll have to pay again if the ombudsman's got to do any work. That's a ballpark figure for you, I would say. The tenant can then settle, can't they, for less than half the fee if they don't go to the ombudsman, and then both parties win, possibly assisted by an AI ambulance chasing service, which collects 50% of the fee won back by the tenant. The reality is, this sort of thing starts happening, then market rent rises start coming with absolute regularity, and everyone gets hurt. As always, the best way to settle any sort of dispute will be via mediation. So, create a private rented sector database to help landlords understand their legal obligations and demonstrate compliance, giving good landlords confidence in their position, alongside providing better information to tenants to make informed decisions when entering into a tenancy agreement. It will also support local councils, helping them target enforcement activity where it is needed most. Landlords will need to be registered on the database in order to use certain possession grounds. I phrased this quite strangely, really, because it doesn't sound like you've got to join the database the way they put it. But they do talk later on about you won't be able to advertise a property without being on the database. But then in theory, you can't advertise a property with an EPC below E at the moment. And I still see them every day. But there we go. £440 million cost, of which 60 to 80% will be loaded onto rents in the short order, with zero measurable, tangible economic benefit. That's the government's own cost-benefit analysis of these changes. It's not mine, right? That's the government's own analysis. So that's effectively what? 300 to 360 million quid's worth of tenant money being spent on this scheme, with the rest coming from the landlord. mind-blowing. But then one more straw to come. It might break some selective licensing schemes. They do talk about this later on. I'm talking about the schemes that are outright scams where they're not selective at all. They try and license a whole city, and it's just utter nonsense that goes on. Should never have been allowed. If landlords were more organised, bigger, worked together more, stuff like that would have been taken straight to the High Court, to be honest, because it's nonsense. But it might break some of these more dodgy schemes. If it doesn't, that's a travesty once more. Anyway, give tenants strength and rights to request a pet in the property, which the landlord must consider and cannot unreasonably refuse. To support this, landlords will be able to require pet insurance to cover any damage to their property. So ASTs already require tenants to take out contents insurance covering their own contents in the event of anything going wrong. Very few tenants do it, even in time, especially in times of cost of living crisis, etc. Gone are the days where it's £50 a month for these policies. Good luck with enforcing this, agents and property managers. I salute you for putting that effort in. Apply the decent home standard to the private rented sector to give renters safer, better value homes and remove the blight of poor quality homes in local communities. I don't see much to fear here, to be honest. If HHSRS was already enforced, there would be very little daylight between the two. Enforcement rather than talk is what we need here. Apply Awab's law to the sector, setting clear legal expectations about the timeframes within which landlords in the PRS must take action to make homes safe where they contain serious hazards. Look, if timeframes are reasonable and workable, that's fine. If you've got to fix a boiler within 6 hours, something you couldn't do in your own house realistically, then I hope there's expected to be a rent premium in these situations for these retainers being in place, because I don't see how the market can necessarily provide that, but there we go. Make it illegal for landlords and agents to discriminate against prospective tenants in receipt of benefits or with children, helping to ensure everyone is treated fairly when looking for a place to live. Look, price does 99% of the discrimination, particularly for benefits already. That won't change anything. We've already got a pick-em market, with supply likely to suffer even more on the back of all of this. So proving discrimination will be very, very difficult indeed, unless landlords and landlords and agents shoot themselves in the foot and they're silly from the start. End the practice of rental bidding by prohibiting landlords and agents from asking for or accepting offers above the advertised rent. Landlords and agents will be required to publish an asking rent for their property, and it will be illegal to accept offers made above this rate. Ah, yes, let's meddle in the market, because that's what we do these days, because we know best. Or all tenancies go up 5% or £50 when they go on the market, whichever's the greater, and then tenants know they have to bid under to get the place. Net result, tenants will pay more overall because of the shortage of supply. Law of unintended consequences 101, and the lack of commercial savvy and understanding of incentives and price setting in a free market that this shows really concerns me. This is naive in the extreme. That's the kindest I can possibly be about this. Strengthen local authority enforcement by expanding civil penalties, introducing a package of investigatory powers, and bringing in a new requirement for local authorities to report on enforcement activity. These powers are already really quite strong, and they're a nice earner. So the winners here will be the lawyers and the defenders, of course. Throw the book at the terrible ones? Absolutely. Start running these departments commercially, and the consequence will be investors turning their backs on rapacious local authorities. The unintended consequence? Tenants pay the fines by the back door. All of them thanks to further rent increases. Strengthen rent repayment orders by extending them to superior landlords, doubling the maximum penalty, and ensuring repeat offenders have to pay the maximum amount. It's pretty rough, overruling precedent law because they don't like what a judge has done, ultimately by protecting the superior landlord. I guess this is what you get when a barrister runs the country, folks. But anyway, let's have a pause for breath. What's not there, in spite of various bits of rhetoric by the overly libertarian, from my political compass standpoint anyway, rent controls. There are no rent controls proposed here that would worry almost anyone. Not even rent stabilisation within tenancies, which I actually expected to be in there. But this will come at some point during this parliament, but they're so slow with the data, they're so slow with the figures, they're just going to see these rents keep on going up and up and up and up and up, and then eventually they're going to be backed into a corner, and then they're going to introduce rent stabilisation, which will, of course, just like it did in Scotland, make more people leave the market. Although I don't think they're going to go down the big mistake made in Scotland route, because it's happened again and again and again all over the Western world, and they don't need to see any more evidence. They're not that stupid, luckily. Or at least Rachel Reeves isn't anyway, while she's still the Chancellor. So the fear is that they just don't understand why, right? It isn't price gouging. It's nothing other than pure fear that's going to put these rents up, or good risk management, realistically, right? That's what it is. The risk to the landlord is going up quite a bit. That means you need a bigger reward for providing the same activity, the same service. That is how a private market works, folks. It's very basic, to be honest. You talk to loads of portfolio landlords. Why property? Don't like the stock market. Why not? It's volatile, right? It's risky. Risky. So introduce more risk into property. How are they going to react to that? Certainly not buy anymore. Certainly maybe sell some. Right? Simple as that. So there won't be anything left other than to control rents in the end, and the final amateurs will leave the market, and the institutions will be delighted because they will have that full control over rents going up by CPI plus 1% every year, or whatever it will be. There's still so many amateurs in this market, right? 94% of properties are still in personal names. Now, look, some of those people are professional portfolio landlords, right? But this transition period is going to be so painful for the tenants. Institutions are currently only the real answer to properties that have been built since about 1980 or so, as a general rule, right? There are exceptions, but there are very few success stories from the PE-funded machines that I know that have bought thousands of old stock. Instead, they're a sprawling, non-compliant mess, according to some insiders that I know, in such organisations. How do you make an institution want a 50-plus-year-old property with no warranties? There might be a way. I've spent some time thinking about this, actually, but it needs sectoral cross-party collaboration, and no one even understands the problem. So the solution is miles and miles away. So back to the meat, which is the abolition of fixed-term tenancies, right? I've spoken briefly on student, and I only see the consequences being PRS landlords being driven out of student housing altogether because any alternative plans would just take too long to enact. Risk there is up gigantically in that area, right? So either that or rents have got to increase dramatically to see this happen. What are the problems that you can have as a student landlord? Number one, house of students moving together in September, fall out in October, 2 months notice, they're out by Christmas and find somewhere else to go. Now they'd have to find somewhere else to go, and that will be the blocker to them maybe putting that notice in, but that's not a great position from the risk management of the landlord. We only work till early June, then we do our exams for the year, then we're all done for the summer. So we actually don't need the house anymore. We can save the rent money, right? Well, that would be great, save the rent money. So what's the landlord got then? A void in June, which they can't let to another student. So they decide either A, the rent needs to go up massively because people are only going to have 8 and 9 month terms and they've got to compensate for that, right? Or they decide to go to professional HMO, social HMO. The thing is, there are shortages in all of those areas. All of those options are on. They do student because they make the most money out of student. That's going to change. When they don't make the most money out of student, they won't provide student. That's the reality of it. And that's a real problem that's going to go on, I think. The grounds on rent arrears will not be as fair as it is in Scotland. I mentioned earlier on, persistent arrears mean mandatory possession in Scotland. And that's disappointing in the current form. They've refused to learn from Scotland. They've tried to learn from Wales. Absolute idiocy, because it just hasn't worked in Wales. But there we go. This would have been a way to show genuine willing in fairer possession for both sides. If you've been in rent arrears 3 times in the past 3 years, 3 separate times, right? Mandatory possession. Something like that. It would show a bit of willing. I don't even think it would kick in that often, but it would show a bit of willing. But there we go. The advice will be simple for people in the end. Use the money claim online system as a proxy instead when rent is owed. This is going to become more and more commonplace. You're going to see it, as people get bigger, corporates institute rules like this all the time, straight to MCOL, so we know we're not messing around. We don't accept late rent. Go and find another landlord that does. That will be the message that comes across, right? No eviction within 12 months to sell the property. Is this a compromise of private property rights? Not really, because that would still happen within a fixed term anyway. You wouldn't be able to evict. So that's not really a big change, I don't think. Of course, it could have been a 6-month fixed term. So it's a bit of a change. But it won't stop the landlord selling with a tenant in situ. This is what price they'll get for selling with a tenant in situ after all this kicks in, of course. Same as they would have had to do if it was a 12-month tenancy, if things changed for them. But we're back to the thin end of the wedge here, folks. We quite like this. So actually, in future, we'll make it 24 months or 36 months until the landlord can ask a tenant to leave. And then the next paragraph, I found a bit of a cornflake choker, to be honest, so I've repeated that in its entirety. In some sectors, it is necessary to move the tenants on where accommodation is intended for a particular purpose For example, where the current tenant may no longer need the accommodation or is no longer eligible to occupy it. We will therefore introduce a limited number of possession grounds to ensure there is an adequate supply of properties in vital sectors such as temporary and supported accommodation, and for critical housing schemes such as stepping stone accommodation. So how long until the first example of an eviction where a tenant ends up in the same accommodation they were already in under a different categorisation at a larger cost to the local authority or the taxpayer? Not long. Bit of a nuance, that argument, but believe me, it will happen. Rent increases once a year doesn't seem unreasonable, something we've always abided by anyway, but again, thin end of the wedges are concerned. Once a year might drift or be capped in future revisions of the Act when we get to a desperation situation in the PRS, which we're now heading towards at a higher speed. Tenant now can't pay more than the landlord asks for in a rent increase. So that was the case. You went to tribunal. If you went to tribunal, you were gambling because the tribunal might have put it up, they might have put it down. Realistically, tribunals are pretty fair, right? They're pretty fair. Unfortunately, from the point of view of the people who've written this bill, that means they've got landlord representation as well as tenant representation, which they don't see as fair in the real world. So what's the likely outcome if you know a tenant will go into dispute? Go straight to market rent, whereas before you would have gone for less of an increase, right? You might as well go high, especially if you know a tenant who's going to challenge it anyway because it can't go upwards. It's genius, isn't it? No backdating. So unless there's a cost to the tenant to go to the tribunal, every single rent increase will be appealed because there appears to be the creation of a situation where there's no downside at all to the tenant going to the tribunal. I'm watching that part with interest. The last piece of guidance simply refers to the fact that instead of doing it the Scottish way and having new types of tenancies from X date and all older tenancies remaining in their current form, this will be the Welsh way, and every contract will need converting on a certain date. This date, of course, could be the date they also mandate to put court reform in by. That was in the old bill, but instead there's just no reference really to court issues at this time at all or sorting them out. The grounds on which Section 8 will be beefed up are then listed. I could make the point that ground 14ZA, based on the offence of rioting, has the same notice period as the condition related to deterioration of furniture, which is ground 15. But what's the point at this stage? I expect some of these will change in the amendments. Lots of new grounds, lots of arbitrary time periods attached is the point, with a clear message that non-payment of rent is the least important issue and therefore carries the longest notice period of any offence. I really don't think much notice has been paid to that point at all. However, in spite of all this, there have been headlines this week like Granger welcomes government renters' rights bill, as the institutional size landlords simply play ball because there's nothing of harm to them in the bill, as they see it, or more accurately, everything in there hurts their competition or the wider market hurts them more than it hurts them. So that was probably the easiest prediction of all. Go big or go home, or adopt an institutional mindset fast. Okay, so I've held off. Where's the good news, right? Well, there's a little compared to some interpretations of the bill online, which have, as usual, mostly been done for clicks rather than any appetite to really assess the costs and the new risks that might be foisted on the sector as a whole. The best sentence in the entire explainer to the bill might well be, the government does not support the introduction of rent controls and nothing in the bill restricts landlords raising rents in line with market prices. If I were a betting man, I'd suggest that this is the influence of Rachel Reeves pulling rank over Angela Rayner here. That's my gut feel, but a pretty strong gut feel, to be honest. Rachel Reeves knows rent controls have got unintended consequences, but as I said earlier, she won't always be the Chancellor, of course. So, there's some supposition, of course. We expect our rental reforms to reduce demand on the courts. And you can see why they think that, right? Because they think Section 21 is obviously used spuriously all the time, but it's just not true. But Section 21 is used. They think they're going to replace that with these new grounds in Section 8, of which now there'll be 36 grounds for possession, and they think they won't apply. But the fact is, they've had to cover 36 scenarios already, and that suggests that it probably would. So what grounds for a Section 21 issuance will actually go away? Well, the insurance serving of them, so a landlord just serves them automatically when 4 months into a tenancy. I think this is a dramatic minority of landlords that do this, but I do know some landlords who do it. But how many extra ones go to court that wouldn't go under the new system? Issuing them is nothing to do with enforcement, realistically. Least line of resistance, well, the easiest way to regain possession is under a 21. People often get told, sometimes they're wrong, realistically. You're much better off with a Section 8 in a lot of circumstances. I see that poor piece of advice be replicated every day across the sector. But once that's gone away, Section 8 gets issued anyway. That's the only way, so that's the way. First sniff of rent arrears, well, as I say, that could be replaced by money claim online anyway, or information around Section 8. Revenge evictions, as are somewhat referred to in the guidance. Well, they're already banned, of course, but nobody's mentioned that. And then tenant won't agree to a rent increase. Well, unless it's above market, which, as I say, I think is a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of rent increases, that won't need issuance of a 21 because the tribunal will agree if it gets there. So I can't see many grounds for the court process to get easier. Even if we have fewer number of cases, Section 8's harder by definition. There's more evidence. There's fault by definition. So fault needs evidencing. Any cases saved will definitely be outweighed by the complexity and time taken for the new grounds. There's much more likelihood for much more argument, and there's precedent to be set. This is the biggest change since the Housing Act 1988, right? Biggest change in 35 plus years. What does that mean? It means all that precedent is thrown out, or a lot of it's thrown out, and new precedent is brought in. Justification for rent arrears grounds being increased is more protection for tenants who temporarily fall into arrears. That's what they say. This is based on no data whatsoever, of course, because if they went to Granger or one of their other darling institutional landlords, they could find the details on how many, once they are 2 months in arrears or more, or 3 months in arrears or more, come back from there. It won't be many. We have a pretty robust arrears management process, and we always use it to try and bring them back from the brink, and we do have some success sometimes. And changing it from 2 months to 3 months will change absolutely none of that whatsoever. But there we go. There's a hat tip to the fact that government wants action first before court reform. This is a big, big thing that the whole of the sector has been lobbying against the whole time. Ben Beadle at the NRLA, Paul Champlina, lots of other people in the space who've been having a go and trying to get their voices heard from the positions that they're in. The RRB will allow landlord-initiated, that means landlord paid for, of course, mediation, enabling disputes to be resolved before being escalated to court. This will effectively be a mandatory step, I can promise you. We are working with the Ministry of Justice to explore further options for early dispute resolution, i.e., we're running before we can walk. It's very clear that the county court is going to remain as the solution. We will continue to work towards digitising the procession process so that when court action is required, it is more efficient and easier for landlords and tenants to understand. So, see which bit of the next bit you might disagree with. Tenants will be able to use the service for free to complain about landlords' actions or behaviours. The service will offer fair, impartial and binding resolutions for tenants and have powers to compel landlords to issue an apology, provide information, take remedial action and or pay compensation. The service will also benefit landlords by resolving tenant-initiated complaints in the quickest and most cost-effective way possible. Landlords will also have guidance to and support from the Ombudsman Service to help them improve their complaint handling practices. Sounds ideologically wonderful, doesn't it? In reality, I suspect that the threat of moving to market rent, bearing that in the last figures from the ONS, current rents are about 13% below market rents as a whole, will act as a real deterrent rather than the theoretical ones that the government have chosen to focus on. We expect that landlords will likely be required to pay a small annual fee per PRS property. The Ombudsman Service will set this fee on the costs of operating an effective service, and we will work with them to ensure it is proportionate and good value. So licensing scheme plus Ombudsman. Scheme likely operates with 5-year licenses, most of them do. Ombudsman probably want a yearly contribution. I suspect sort of 300 to 400 quid per property all in over a 5-year time period. Could be much cheaper if there was an appetite to do that, but I doubt there is. The government refused to understand that any further costs will be reflected in higher rents again, because they prefer to deny how price elasticity of demand works. They prefer to deny how markets work. In fairness, the Conservatives are exactly the same. They did not want to hear the point that putting costs up of delivery will put the cost up to the consumer, which is so stupid, but there we go. You can only sigh in these situations. And yes, to confirm to those of you who are kindly listening to this, putting yourselves in my shoes, it will be a bad day at the office. Yes, it will. Simply the administration of it makes me cringe, let alone the short-term financial impact. But it's time to adopt an institutional mindset, folks. The barriers to entry go up. The barriers to entry go up. So, there's confirmation that landlords will still need to join the Ombudsman Service even if they use a letting agent. And if you opt out of the database, there can be a civil penalty of up to £7,000. There's confirmation they'll look at selective licensing, but not by the look of it from what they've said, with any real appetite to get rid of it. And then the naivety continues to shine through as we go through the guidance, for example. Landlords and agents will continue to have the final say on who they let their property to. Oh, thanks a lot. And can carry out referencing checks to make sure tenancies are sustainable for all parties. Look, encouraging referencing is not going to help a huge part of the tenant base, but there we go. They'll be able to do this based on affordability. Gee, thanks a lot. But not on the basis the prospective tenant has children or is in receipt of benefits. Look, I've already said, spare money does 99% of the work here ultimately, and the market rent rising again and again and again and again and again will do even more of the work. They also confirm they'll override mortgage, lease and insurance conditions not to let properties to those in receipt of benefits. And do you know what? Morally, I think jolly good. Pretty heavy-handed legal chat, but price will always be the discriminator. Unless they overhaul housing benefit, ha ha ha. Cost of the bill is just too much to even think about increasing more than inflation. But anyway, the FAQ for their rental market bidding wars dodges the number one question that should be asked us before. Won't the landlords just raise the rent in the first place if they want to maximise rents and if bidding wars are a real thing? And will there just be a Dutch auction, won't there? Two reasons for this. One, they don't even realise how behaviour will change. Or two, they do, they just can't answer that question. Pets will encourage a change in structure for larger landlords, I'm sure. It will always be reasonable for a landlord to refuse a request when their superior landlord prohibits pets. We will provide guidance to landlords and tenants to support decisions. This will encourage the structure that is already sparingly used for various purposes, including providing another layer of insurance, let the properties to your own rent-to-rent company effectively, and then onto the tenant via the rent-to-rent company structure. What other points need to be highlighted at this stage? The proposals move the civil penalty, remember no court, to 40,000 from 30,000, the max civil penalty. That's some inflation for you, isn't it? And 99% plus, I've got nothing to fear here, but extra risk is still introduced if councils decide to drive a bit of revenue via this methodology. And rent repayment orders to round off will increase to 24 months rather than 12, upping the incentive for the ambulance chasers here, and they'll want to ensure these are extended to superior landlords so that unscrupulous operators could not use the arrangement I've detailed, where you could rent to yourself and thus avoid rent repayment orders, although your sub-company would still be liable anyway. So that would ensure the right people are held to account. Translation: more vanilla rent to rent, which as a landlord is already completely fraught with risk, just got more risky as well. Now, if you've listened before, you'll know I hate problems without solutions, so we need to have a bit of a regroup as we finish. Number one, this is the first pass of the bill, or the guidance as I've analysed today. There's 6 to 9 months left of batting back and forth on this. Number two, there are over 100 landlords in the Commons and the Lords, which will provide some real world experience, although I suspect that experience may well be concentrated in London and might not reflect the reality of the rental market throughout the country. Number three, the message is very much go big or go home. That was the message in 2015 from George Osborne, and that's still the party line, even if it is a new party. Number four, there's mitigation for much of this, and whilst it will be a pain and a financial pain, it simply builds more walls for people getting into the sector. There will be hundreds of organisations, number five, far larger than me or you, working to assess the real change in risk in the sector. Keep an eye on the headlines for this. Number six, when risk pricing changes in economics, prices go up. This is an indisputable fact. One thing we're not seeing with wage increases as they've been is any kind of struggle to get a tenant who can afford a property at the enhanced market rents that are now on display. There are struggling tenants, of course, but with 22 applicants per average property according to Zoopla, that is very much a one-way struggle. Number seven, price controls are not here in any realistic form. There's already plenty of legislation that can be used to challenge rent increases. This just in theory simplifies it. That's not terrible and not unreasonable either. Number eight, it is disappointing that they have chosen to pretend this really offers any benefit or improvement for landlords. Perhaps clearer comms around market rents when it comes to rent increases will be of benefit. Perhaps the once every 12 months maximum being clearer will also be of benefit. With institutions, you definitely expect a clockwork style rent increase every year, and the smaller operators will be forced into the same boat, I'm sure. Number nine, there's most definitely the chance this will force further, largely small operators out of the sector and be the straw that breaks the camel's back. We've already seen instructions to sell and not let in our businesses this week after the first draft of the bill, from landlords who have properties on the open market that were to rent and now want to sell. This will also be a further deterrent to new entrants. This could be a really significant deterrent if lenders were to start only to want to lend to existing landlords or existing portfolio landlords. This would be a disaster for the supply of rental housing, but a gigantic bonus to those who remain in the sector. And number 10, this is all without consideration to the budget. If stamp duty was to go up to 4% for additional property purchases, that's the price in Wales, let alone 6%, which is the price in Scotland, just imagine what that would do for the supply of new stock. If you're wondering what it would do, go and have a look at the £1 in every 20 being lent for buy-to-let in Scotland, and then put 2 and 2 together about how basic economics works. So I do have concerns we're heading towards dystopia. Horrific for the tenants, quite lucrative for the landlords, to be honest. I don't worry that a sudden flood of rentals hit the market and affect the wider house price in the UK. Landlords don't move quickly in reality. There aren't enough voids at any one time to really make a difference in the market. Selling a property with a tenant in situ is just going to attract even more of a discount than it already does, because that risk level is notching up one more time. We'll see how many Section 21s are served in the next 6 to 9 months. Actually, we won't see that. All we'll see is how many make it to court in reality, and how many properties come to market before the bill becomes law. There won't be no changes, but precedent dictates that the Lords will argue to an extent until blue in the face, but not block a bill going through from a government with such a large majority. There's only one thing we know for sure right now. The dominant strategy will be, of course, to keep calm and carry on. And I hope today has added some value to much of the other commentary out there, perhaps answers a few questions, settles a few nerves, explains my mindset around it. Before I go, one more mention of the Property Business Workshop, 4th one of the year, the last one this year, bit.ly/PBWFOUR, Tuesday 1st of October, 2 days early bird left to go. And you know what I'm going to say to close us off one more time. There's only one way to deal with this continual noise and mixed messages. Keep calm, always listen to the supplement, of course, and carry on. And now I'm just going to address a couple of the bits that I've seen in the chat today. Thanks, Scott, for tuning in. Shyam. Now or next week, could you touch on the change on Basel 3.1 amendments and what this will mean for buy-to-let challenger banks, as it was positive news? I can cover that pretty briefly, really, because the point was Basel and the regulations have essentially affected the capital requirements for banks. So said, how much capital do you need to keep back before you lend money out? So for those who know, we operate a fractional reserve system of banking in this country. I can lend out 100 million with a much smaller fraction of that 100 million actually being available at any one time, right? I create money that way. It leverages things. The whole economy, the whole world operates on credit, realistically. 97% is credit. Those requirements were put up after the financial crisis because, frankly, banks were operating on tracing paper and they almost had unlimited access to money, and they made some bad loans they should never have made in the first place. Basel affected the EU and the European countries, and we were much more conservative after that than the US was. This is why you had US banks going broke last year, apart from anything else. Their capital requirements were not put up enough. The proposal was to put their capital requirements up by needing 20% more capital in the States, which has been cut to about 10%. Our cap requirements are already arguably sufficient because the Bank of England had already done lots of stress tests around all of this using the 2008 financial crisis behaviour, so they were pretty confident anyway. So needing less capital means that challenger banks, for example, can lend more than they otherwise would have been able to with their existing capital base. But let's be clear, Shyam, the capital requirement is still going upwards, so there still is more requirement for them to post more capital before they do more lending. So helpful, yes, definitely. They would all rather that we had less regulation rather than more. It helps in the sector to deregulate as a rule, as you know. But you also know, before 2008, we deregulated too far. And what you see was, in a Wild West style environment, too many people get lent money that couldn't afford it. And then there's problems with recovery and all the rest of it. And then thank you everyone else for your comments of this week. I appreciate the comments about finally coming out strongly about the stupidity of socialism. I don't think I've changed my position on any of this mark at any point in time. I simply call it like it is. I have no room for ideology either way. I only have room for facts and data. And that's why I act and analyse in the way that I do. But I thank you for listening. Thanks everyone for the comments, the likes, and all the rest of it. If you could share this with anyone else you think might be interested in it, I'd appreciate it. It helps the channel out lots. Thanks for listening, and I'll be back next week. Cheers. Keep calm and carry on.